Mary Nordale's family has deep roots in Fairbanks. Her grandfather, Anton Nordale, built the Nordale Hotel. Her father, and Anton, served in the Alaska Legislature, and her mother, Katherine, was clerk of the court, or assistant clerk of the court, as we'll find out, in Fairbanks, and a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Additionally, Mary's family was friends with Senator Bob Bartlett. Following college and some other stints we'll talk about, she went to Washington, D.C. as one of the secretaries in Senator Bartlett's office. Realizing her prospects were limited in that role, she attended George Washington University Law School at night. After graduation, she returned to Fairbanks eventually as assistant U.S. attorney, then shifted from the federal to the state side and served as state district attorney. Governor Bill Sheffield tapped Mary as Alaska's Commissioner of Revenue, and she's played important civic roles in many ventures over the years, including a committee overseeing the efforts to move the capital from Juneau. In her practice, she has appeared or been a friend of the court in 14 cases argued before the state Supreme Court. So please welcome Mary Nordale.
Oh, thank you.
Now, let's begin with your grandfather, Anton Nordale. He was both a miner in Dawson and, I've been dying to use this term, Mary, hotelier.
Pardon?
I've been dying to use this expression all my life, hotelier.
Oh,
Someone
yes,
who
yes,
owns
yes.
and operates a hotel. I've never been able to use it before, but with your grandfather, I can.
Sure.
And he built a hotel in Cleary and one in Fairbanks, right?
Yes, he built 2 hotels in Fairbanks, actually.
That's
right. But both burned down ultimately. But the first hotel that he had in this part of Alaska was in Cleary City, and he had the Grand Hotel there.
Mm. And they were fairly posh, I understand.
Pardon?
They were fairly posh.
Well, yes. He liked luxury, like all of us. Comfort more than luxury.
So, as you say, the one that was built on the banks of the Chena burned down, but he wasn't deterred, and then he built another one on 2nd Avenue, right?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the story I heard was that he ran across the street while the hotel was burning and talked to the owner of 2 warehouses that were side by side on the 2nd Avenue, between 2nd and 3rd Avenue, and said he'd buy those warehouses, and that's what he did. And he renovated them and put them together. It's the 2nd Nordale Hotel.
Now, your dad worked in the family hotel as a clerk, right?
Yes, and then later as a manager or assistant manager when my grandfather's health was deteriorating, and he was unable to carry the burden.
Mm-hmm. And that's where you eventually met your mom.
Yes.
Do you have any stories about that meeting?
Well, my mother was pretty reticent, and in large measure because she was still suffering the loss of my father, and it really caused her a lot of pain to talk about it. So I didn't press it. But, well, that's enough.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get and talk about your mom and the trying times following your dad's accident where he perished in the airplane accident, both sides of your family were very civically engaged because, of course, as I mentioned, you're on your dad's side, both your dad and, I understand, his dad were in the territorial legislature, and your mother's side of the family has several lawmakers in her branch. Is that right?
Yes. On my mother's side, there were no, well, I'm not sure about it. her father acted as mayor many times for this small town in eastern Washington where they had their business. He was active in the Democratic Party, but I don't think he ever served as a legislator or as a councilman in the city government.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And your mom came up to Fairbanks to teach, is that right?
Yes, in 1926.
And
she lived at the Nordale Hotel and ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or just maybe breakfast and dinner, at the Model Cafe, which was then located at about where Lavelle's is now.
Huh?
Is my memory okay on that
Yeah.
one?
Well, we have some historians in the audience, so we'll find out.
Okay.
But also, your dad eventually left the hotel and became clerk of the court for the federal court, right?
It was the federal court, yes, that's
Yeah.
correct. And it was shortly before actually his death that he took that job, and he went on vacation to help celebrate in Dawson Discovery Day, which was a big thing there. And he had been born in Dawson and had lots of friends there. And it was on the way back that he ran into a mountain.
The plane ran into a man. I'm going to it's a sensitive topic, I understand, but what was the impact on the family and your mom? It must have been considerable.
Oh, it was devastating.
Yeah.
You really have to hand her, she was quite a gal. She applied to the judge to take my father's position as clerk of court. And the judge said no, she couldn't have the job because she was a woman and she would have to be in court and would hear things that no lady should hear. My mother used to bring that story out every once in a while. She was both amused and angry about it. And so then she said, well, what about the assistant clerk? And he said, okay. So, so that's how she became assistant clerk.
Okay, and one last point before we follow her trajectory and the family's move to Juneau. You talked about your grandfather's entrepreneurial skill and pivoting directly and getting a new place for the new hotel, but it became a kind of a central point. And wasn't Ava McGowan, didn't she live there? And it was a sort of a place to be. Did you have memories of the hotel?
Oh yeah, I stayed in it 2 or 3 times. Because when we moved from Fairbanks, I had no place to live in Fairbanks except the hotel, and it was free.
You got a discount, a steep discount.
And I got to know the people who were working in the hotel, managing and at the desk and stuff. And every once in a while, one of them would lean over and he'd say, can't you do something about Edith McGowan? Can't you get her out of here? Because she was really deteriorating because of age and health. And they were very worried about getting her out if something happened. Well, something happened and they couldn't get her out. And so it's been a burden on the family's spirit ever since. She was harmless, sometimes a pest, but harmless. And many people admired her and found her intriguing. And it hurts to know that she lost her life in property owned by my family.
I can imagine. Well, while we're reflecting back on those times, do you have any vivid memories of growing up in Fairbanks?
Oh, yeah.
Well, share some.
Well, my brother and I, my mother had, of course, to hire babysitters and housekeepers. One of the babysitters was Francie Link's mom. And then shortly, I'm not sure exactly, Francie couldn't clear it up, but when my mother bought the cabin we were in, oh, and by the way, that cabin is an historic monument now. It's at the east entrance of the farmer's market, the front half of the building. And Francie will also, her folks ultimately bought it, and so she lived in it too. So it's a very historic building. We had a lot of babysitters, but we had two other mothers. One was Vidi Bartlett, and the other was a woman who lived across the street from us. She was half native and half, let's see, it was Canadian, French-Canadian from Massachusetts, her dad. And her mom was part of the Tanana people. And she was almost worse than a policeman sometimes. You know, she really fly out of the house yelling at us and getting us back in order. But she was an absolutely wonderful woman. And I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have had her as an influence in my life.
Well, I remember hearing one story about how close-knit the Fairbanks community was in those days when you took a bike excursion.
You want that story?
Oh, I do.
Well, I was, maybe 6 or 7. And of course, I had a bump of curiosity about as big as this room. And I was sick and tired of having conversations changed in front of me, or when I appeared close enough to hear and understand, and it would quiet down, and they'd be talking about this area of the community. And I was really puzzled, and my mother did not encourage any questions about that, and so I needed to find out what it was all about. So one day I had a bicycle. It was my brother's outgrown, and I put on a dress deliberately that had a full skirt because the bicycle was a boy's bike, and I needed to have a full skirt so it wouldn't fall over my knees. I'll be a modest little girl. And headed off. And I went to this place that they were all talking about, 4th and 5th Avenue on the other side of Cushman Street. And I was looking around and I think, what are all these little houses doing? I mean, what's going on here? Why is this such? And all of a sudden the door of one of those cabins flew open and a woman tore out yelling at me, Mary, get out of here. Go home. Get out of here. Your mother doesn't want you here. Go on. Get out of here. Well, with that as encouragement, I turned around and went home in a hurry. I never told my mother, and my mother never mentioned it, so I don't know whether she knew about it. But that taught me that you can't get away with anything in a small town. I was telling that story to a group of miners. I was chairman of the local branch for a while. And, at the beginning of each meeting, we introduce ourselves and state our affiliation. And I said, when I was brushing my teeth this morning, I realized that I never introduced myself. And I said, I guess it's because I grew up in Fairbanks and everybody knew who I was anyway. And they kind of chuckled. And then I told them the story about my adventure. And they just roared. They thought it was a really good one. So.
Well, eventually your mom is tapped to lead the state's war bond drive.
Yes.
And that's a pretty prestigious post during World War II. How did she get that? And what was the trip like to Juneau?
Well, she got the job because of the influence of Ernest Greening, who was the governor at the time, and Bob Bartlett, who was our delegate in Congress at the time. And Bob knew that she needed a better job than what she had. And so that one came open, and she was appointed. The trip from Fairbanks to Juneau for her to take the job started by train from Fairbanks and went as far as Curry. And we all got off the train and went into the hotel at Curry and got our rooms. And you can imagine now stopping at Curry, which would be a few, 2 hours down the road? And it was a whole day's ride on the train. And it was a coal-fired, steam-operated train. So everybody on the train was dirty. When we got to the room, Mother got us settled. I think we had dinner, and then she said, she went into the bathroom and turned the water on. She said, okay, Mary, you take the first bath. I looked at the water. I said, I'm not taking a bath in that. I was 9 years old, you understand? Knew about these things. And she said, well, what's the matter? I said, that water's blue. And I was used to orange water, good Fairbanks orange water. My mother finally convinced me that it would not poison me if I took a bath in the blue water. So then the next day we boarded the train again, went to Anchorage, got off the train, went to a hotel, Anchorage Hotel. I don't know if it's still there or not. And then the following, I'm not sure, it was just the next day. It could have been a later day because it was wartime, and the military was running the train, calling the shots and who in the train could run and when it could not, and that kind of stuff. So we ultimately got back on the train and got to Seward, boarded the ship, and we were in blackout mode the whole trip. And of course it was...
What did that mean?
It was December. What?
What did that mean? Everything was dark on the ship?
All of the windows, doors, were closed somehow,
Blacked out?
Cloaked, the door cloth so that it would close right away if you went through it, And the windows were all covered, and you were cautioned about opening any of them if the lights were on, because there were Japanese submarines in the Gulf of Alaska. And it was a bit unnerving to know that those submarines were out there and loaded. If they wanted to take us out, they could have. But they didn't. They were smart enough not to do that because they weren't ready. What they wanted to do was just reconnaissance so that they could figure out how to deal with Midway Island. And I don't know if any of you have ever read the history of Midway Island, but it's a tiny little black dot due north of the main island, Hawaii. And, but it was a very crucial and strategic point. It had ship facilities and had airfields and just enough space to house the army. And the Japanese wanted to take that, and our military decided that they were not going to allow that because that would have given the Japanese dominance of the Gulf of Alaska, and that would have been just ruinous as far as war effort in that part of the world. So it was an unnerving trip in many ways to be riding across the Gulf of Alaska with knowing that there were subs in the water and ready to fire off if they felt like it. But we finally made it to Juneau and moved into the house that Bob and Heidi lived in with them. They offered us space until we could find a place to live. And we managed to settle in. And my mother thoroughly enjoyed that job because it gave her an opportunity to travel around the state, or territory at the time, and get to know people and see what was what, and get rid of us for a while. And she enjoyed the opportunity of selling war bonds. It was
Well, you
good,
graduate from high school in Juneau.
Yeah.
What are some of your memories of wartime Juneau and afterwards, Mary?
Well, you know, Juneau is on a channel, and it's protected by Douglas Island. So, and the channel is not terribly deep, so it can only accommodate ships of a certain size. So there was not a lot of activity. Some. We had Coast Guard. We had the military communications people, ACS. It started out as Army Communications, became after statehood Alaska Communications, and there was a Army camp out along the highway out of Juneau, near where the airport is now. But the most interesting thing to me is how Juneau managed to survive, because most of the foodstuffs sold in the community and served in any of the restaurants came in by boat. And it wasn't until there was, after the end of the war, there was this longshoreman strike in Seattle, and I think other ports on the West Coast, and that stopped food shipments that had been coming in by boat. And I can remember walking into a grocery store and the echo of your footsteps on the floor. You know, there was nothing on the shelves. The problem that everybody faced was, how do you get food into Juneau? And they ultimately started flying food in. So that's how we got air service, and we got much better fresh veggies because of it.
Well, you graduate from high school. Was there ever any question whether you'd go on to college?
No, absolutely none. Mm-hmm. My mother would have taken me by the hand and taken me to college and thrown me in the door if I'd said otherwise.
Well, what did you major in college? And you spent a year overseas, is that right?
Yes. I majored in English literature, minored in French, and all of us had to take a compulsory minor in philosophy. And
excellent program. I'm so glad to hear. As a philosophy major myself.
I really enjoyed it. And then after 3 years at the university, I decided I just wanted out for a while. I had to get out. So I talked my mother into letting me go to Europe on a program, you know, year abroad type thing. And I was fortunate to go to Vienna, Austria. Didn't know a word of German, but picked up a few. And our courses were under the auspices of the university, and we had some really nice professors and a grand time, and they took us on tours for spring break and that kind of thing, so we got to travel around too. So I went to Spain, went to Italy, Rome, and Venice, and I think that was it. Let's see, we went, I'm drawing a blank. I think those were the main trips. We had a trip in Germany, but we didn't get to Berlin. And we were catching this friend of mine, well, actually a classmate from the university. We're going to catch our boat home from England. And so we did our own tour in England. And so we had it was a really full year. It was a wonderful year. And of course, it was the first time I ever had the luxury of being able to go up to the box office and buy a ticket to go to the opera, live opera. And there were 2 opera houses that we could go to. And that was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, so, college in earlier times was a place to round out a person's personality and forge relationships and new ideas. And it sounds like that really was the case with yours.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, following college, it's sort of interesting, Mary, you have these intersections with important historical periods, people, and activities. You worked for a time in Egan's office, Bill Egan's office.
Yes. Well, when I first got out of college, got my degree, my diploma, I went to Seattle, worked there for a while. The statehood bill passed while I was working in Seattle. And I asked my mother, if I apply for a job with the legislature, can I live at home? She said, oh, sure. So I did. And I was appointed to assistant clerk of the House of Representatives for the first session of the first state legislature. And the reason I'm doing this kind of roundabout is that in the process, Bill Egan was governor, and I had known Bill for quite a while, and the guy who was the lieutenant governor, Hugh Wade, we were neighbors, and I was in school with his son and daughter, and so it was kind of a family enterprise there. Oh, and the executive assistant to Bill was a guy by the name of Burke Riley. Many of you may have heard of Burke. And he was, when my brothers and my other mother moved away from living across the street from us, Burke and 2 of his buddies moved into the house. And so I got to know Burke when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And so he was very helpful in getting me a job. So I had applied. After the legislature was over, I went up to the governor's office and spent about a year until we had a serious disagreement, and I said, "Phooey, I'm out of here."
Is it true it had to do with the requisitioning of a ladder?
Yes. Yes. Well, the governor's office was kind of a long string of rooms, and the lieutenant governor's office was at one end, and the governor's office was at the other. And if you needed to have anything done out of the lieutenant governor's office, you had to walk this mile. In the mile were a couple of vaults, concrete vaults. And this is an old federal building that I guess it's still in use as a Capitol. And I was walking over to the lieutenant governor's office, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of the governor's press assistant climbing up the metal shelves in the vault, reaching for some material, because he also distributed brochures and stuff to kids. Oh, I want to learn all about Alaska, and he sent them. So they were storing these pamphlets in the vault, not because they were so precious, but there just was no other room to store them. And but Frank, whose last name I can't remember, would climb the shelves and get the material out. Frank was about 6 feet tall, probably around 60, overweight, probably by 100 pounds. I mean, he was not in great shape. And all I could see just in that brief glimpse, was him crashing down, hitting his head on the steel shelves, falling into the concrete of the vault, and if not dying, suffering permanent injury, which would incapacitate him. And I couldn't tolerate it. So I put on a jacket and ran down to Sears and ordered a $12.50 stepladder. And it was either a day or 2 days later, I was called into the governor's office, and seated with him was the commissioner of administration, whom I had known for years and had babysat his kids. And I was sort of read the riot act for having disobeyed the requisition process, which was true. I didn't even think about it. I just was so horrified at the idea of Frank's falling, messing up the vault and messing up his life and his wife's life, that I just didn't hesitate. And I volunteered to pay for the ladder. That was going to be a problem. But they just beat on me and said, well, maybe we could turn somebody loose in admin and they can run over the rules and regs with you. Because I was new on the job. I didn't know what I was doing. But no such offer, and I thought, you turkeys, you can sit there and read me up one side and down the other, but I'm not going to stick around for any more of it. So I said, I'm quitting. I'm out of here. Goodbye. Went to my desk, packed it up, went home. And announced to my mother, now I'm free and I want to take a vacation in Fairbanks because I hadn't been back since we had moved. So I was doing that, and I had just gotten out of the bathtub and getting dressed to, I guess, catch a plane or something. Phone rang. It was Bob Bartlett. I want you to come back to Washington. Well, I wasn't a little certain about it. Yeah, well, I need you to go to work for me now in Anchorage. So I want you to go down to Anchorage, find some office space. And I said, I'm on vacation. I'm going on vacation. Well, when are you back? When will you be back? Well, I told him he'd be back in a week or so. And so he said, well, call me when you get back. So I did, and we set it up. So I went to Anchorage, looked for space and found it, and got it set up. And then Mary Lee Council arrived. She was administrative assistant to Bob, and she was the daughter of a physician who had worked for the Kennecott copper mine company in Cordova, and her mother was a nurse, and they met there at the hospital in Cordova. And Mary Lee because she was from Cordova, knew the Diamond family, and when Tony Diamond was our delegate in Congress before Bob, she worked in his office. And so then when Bob took over, Tony resigned and retired, Mary Lee, when Bob was elected, and Mary Lee went to work for Bob as his administrative assistant. So she had to have office space in Juneau because Bob was going to be spending a lot of time. He had to because it was an election year, for one thing. But it was relatively new to have an office in Alaska for the delegates. And so, because the delegates never got much office money. So it meant that Bob would be extremely busy dealing with people directly about their problems. And he had a little pad that was a refillable pad put out by IBM, I think it was. Anyway, it's called Think. And he'd pull this Think pad out, and he'd be making notes like crazy. Nobody could read his handwriting but him, and I'm not sure he did a good job of that. And but he would make these notes on people he had talked with, what the problems were. Then he'd sit down with Mary Lee or me and dictate what those notes had, and then that problem or whatever it was would be spread around the rest of the staff in Washington. It was a really good system. But anyway, that's what he needed, the office, so we had it from...
Do I have this right that when you go back to Washington, D.C. to work for his office there, it was around Kennedy's inauguration?
Yes, I arrived there the day before Kennedy was inaugurated.
And that was a pretty cold day.
Yes, it was terrible.
Yeah.
What was even worse was the day before. It snowed, and the snow in Washington is wet snow. And it probably snowed to at least 2 feet. And I don't think I had any boots. So I was in the office, and I was staying with Bob and Vidi, so I was riding home with Bob. But in order to, we had to get out of the car from time to time because people were stalled, and and so I don't know that I've ever been so chilled in my life. It was just awful. And so I didn't want to be outdoors during the inauguration because I was still feeling cold, but we watched it on TV. And it was fun. And prior to that, during the time I was in Anchorage, I had met Kennedy. He was up campaigning, kind of a surprise. And there was a cocktail party, and I attended, of course. And at the cocktail party, Wendell Kay, I don't know if any of you ever knew Wendell. He was a very prominent attorney in Anchorage. Very bright guy. But he was all too frequently in his cups. And I was introduced as an employee of Bob Bartlett in Anchorage. And Wendell came out of the crowd yelling, "She can't be working for Bob. I didn't tell him that. He didn't even consult with me. She's not an employee." Well, you can imagine what that did. The Kennedy crowd just about dropped its teeth. And I was just like a statue. And the two McCutcheon brothers came to my rescue and hauled Wendell away. And I never really made it up with Wendell. He tried. And I liked his wife very much, but I just could not warm up to Wendell, because I thought, you know, what he did was really embarrass, and he embarrassed Bob, he embarrassed the Kennedy group, everybody. And, you know, it didn't mean anything to me because I was a nothing. And but, you know, to have somebody throw a temper tantrum at a political rally for a potential president of the United States, to perform that, I just could not say, all is forgiven, Wendell. I couldn't do it. So unfortunately, we never, I would see him from time to time, even had dinner with him and his wife on occasion. But it was, you know, always a little distant.
I can imagine. Well, it's while you're working in Bartlett's office in Washington, D.C., you decide to go to law school. So you attend law school in the evening while working during the day.
Right.
That's long hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
right.
What were the prospects for women back then, and how many other women were in your class in law school?
Well, I got to know, and I can't recall just exactly, maybe it was when I enrolled at law school, a couple of women who were attorneys in federal government jobs. And there were a few women scattered throughout the federal service. There was one other girl in the law school in our class, and there must have been 50 boys, something like that. So it was not what you'd call even Steven when it came to placements. All of the other students, of course, were going to night school, law school, and they worked during the day. So we were all under the same kind of pressure. So we didn't have much collegiality. Although there was one guy who was in law school. He was in our office. So he and I would go to school together. You know, he had a car. So we didn't have to catch the bus or thing. But other than that, there was one guy I used to walk up to a bus stop on my way home, because the guy from our office lived way away, opposite side of the area. And so I would walk with him just because it was kind of a grungy area of town. And I didn't want to be all by myself. And so he was very nice. But other than that, there wasn't really much contact. And it was kind of too bad, because it would have been nice if, you know, if you'd had more communication. But when I seriously went into law, when I was working as a lawyer, the discrimination against women was pretty obvious here in Fairbanks and in the courtroom. And, you know, it was really, really tiresome.
Well, let's get you back to Fairbanks in 1968. But before we do that, I meant to ask you earlier, while you're in college, your mom is a delegate in the Constitutional Convention.
Yes. I was in Austria, by the way.
You were in Austria.
Uh-huh.
So did she ever share memories or impressions from that?
Oh yes, yes, she was wonderful. I was really lucky. She had been a teacher, so she had a real bent, and her mother had been a teacher, so there was a lot of interest in teaching. And she was really interested in telling me as much as she could remember about the convention and why they did what they did. As a matter of fact, she dragged out a copy of the Constitution, and she said, "Come on, sit down beside me on the couch. I want to go over this with you." I said, "Oh, it's such a nice day. We're getting some sunshine in Juneau. Why can't we?" "No, I'm going to do it today." And she went from the beginning of the Constitution to the end and told me what they had talked about, why they put the words in that they did put in. Of course, much of it was drawn on the model of the U.S. Constitution, but there were regional or state-type issues that had to be dealt with, as original matter. And so she would explain why they put that in and why it was done. And it was the most wonderful education I could have had on the Constitution of the state of Alaska. Now, ask me questions about it now, I might not be able to remember. But it really impressed me with how marvelous an experience for her it had been. She was fulfilled in a way I don't think she ever expected to be, because it was the kind of working on a document that was so meaningful to her. And it was a pleasure to see her and listen to her. Because she did enjoy it. What?
That's wonderful. Okay, so in 1968, you returned to Fairbanks as Assistant U.S. Attorney?
Yes. Well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so what was the job like, and what was your impression of Fairbanks returning after all those years?
Well, my impression of Fairbanks was that it was in pretty good shape and looked a lot better than it looked when I was a kid. And there were more restaurants and more things to do. But what my duties were, just a standard attorney for the federal government. Criminal prosecutions, civil prosecutions, document review, all that kind of stuff that you just normally do. And I worked closely with the IRS. I accused one guy of being a smash and grab guy, and he got real upset with me. Don't say things like that. And I also worked with the FBI guys, and they were nice to work with. They were very polite and accommodating, and did not give me the brush off because I was a female. And that was kind of a pleasure. Unusual.
Well, in a year or two, you move over to the state then and work as assistant attorney there, right?
Right. I resigned from the U.S. Attorney's Office because Nixon was elected and I knew I was going to get fired. So I thought, well, I'll just get ahead of the game and get a job elsewhere. So I talked to the guy who was the district attorney here in Fairbanks, and it just so happened that we had been freshmen in college together. So he knew me and I knew him, and so he gave me a job. And he didn't even consult with the Attorney General, and I got a call from the Attorney General. He said, I didn't approve of your being hired. And I said, "You're going to fire me?" Well, no, they weren't going to do that, but he just wanted me to know that I was not his first choice by a long stretch.
I'm starting to see a pattern, ladders and then moving. But you go into practice not long after that. And I have a question about being an attorney back then. Were there sufficient a number of attorneys that you could specialize in, just like wills or workman's comp or something like that? Or did you really have to be fluent in all sort of aspects of law?
You pretty much had to be a generalist, because it wasn't so much the attorneys being enough attorneys, it was the population wasn't large enough to support a lot of specialization. I mean, this is just a side note. There was an attorney in Sitka, and he nearly starved to death along with his family until another attorney arrived. And so there was competition and opposition. And attorneys have to have opposition because, why do you sue? Why, one side it says this and the other side says that. But if you have nobody to talk to, what's the point? So it's necessary to have enough attorneys to work, but you have to have a population that needs the services.
Mm. So. Mm-hmm. Well, as we move closer to the top of the hour, I do want to talk to you about a couple of other ventures that you were involved with and how they came about. For example, Bill Sheffield asks you to become revenue commissioner, but that was preceded by some interesting developments. Can you talk a little bit about entering the executive branch of government?
Well, it was a different experience. I had been in the legislative branch, and then in terms of the state, I had only worked little jobs, mostly just to earn tuition money, go back to college every summer I'd work, but when I went with the Sheffield administration, I was appointed Commissioner of Revenue. And I had won the, it was kind of interesting. The guy who preceded me in that job had been a man I had worked with on a transition committee for the Sheffield administration. And when he had to leave because of family matters, Francie, do you want to turn that off? But he and I had become friends in this thing, and when he left because of family matters, he recommended me to Bill Sheffield, and Bill said, okay. And he called me up. Oh, no, this friend of mine called me up, and he said, what would you think about being a Commissioner of Revenue? I said, what are you talking about? He explained what was happening, and I said, well, yeah, I'd like that. And I had a wonderful time. It was really great. We had lots to do, and the Revenue Commissioner is in charge of managing the money of the state. The Department of Administration issues the checks, pays the bills, keeps the accounts, all that kind of stuff. What an accountant's office would do. The Revenue Office is, one, collects the taxes, but in our state, manages the permanent fund dividend program, sits on the bond committee so that all the bond sales go before the commissioner and the committee. And all kinds of unusual things come up. And one of the most, one that just always tickles me, the state had issued some bonds, and it's a very important function because it builds up cash for meeting usually construction costs for projects, roads, schools, whatever. And the process is that the bonds are sold through financial firms, let's say back in New York City, and the state enters into an agreement with a bank that has a trust department, usually, and the contract is to receive the funds that the state pays out on a monthly basis to cover the redemption of the bonds. So if you bought a bond from the state, you would be getting interest and a bit of the principal back on a regular basis. And many people in the time I was in the department were using bonds as an investment tool because the payments were coming in regularly and they were living on that income, and it was a way to keep the money safe, and those of us who are elderly need to have a little help from time to time. And so the state had, prior to my entering the department, had entered into a contract with a bank in California. And the money would be transmitted on a monthly basis to the bank to cover what was due for repayment to the bondholders on a particular bond issue. The guy who headed up the Treasury Division in the Department of Revenue came to me and he said, I got a call from somebody in New York saying, how come the state is not paying the bonds, paying, the installments on the bonds? And I said, well, what's the problem? Why aren't we? He said, we are. So apparently we discovered the bank that we had contracted with to remit the payments, I think it was within 36 hours of their receipt, because it was an electronic transfer. But they would remit the payments and distribute it to the bondholders and right away, within 36 hours. And these payments were not going through. At the time, it was very fashionable to do what is called overnight lending. And there's a requirement that banks insured by the federal government carry a certain amount of cash on hand all the time. And every night they have to reconcile the books and make sure they've got enough cash to carry them through the day. And I figured, and I think I'm right, I didn't really inquire into it, that the bank was taking this money and holding it, doing overnight lending for 3 or 4 days, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. And the people who were counting on getting repaid on these bonds were in terrible plight, because if they were living on that income, they were in real deep weeds. So I said to the guy who headed up the Treasury Department, well, can we find another bank? He said yes, right away. I said, well, go get one. And he did. And I said, then order all of the funds transferred from this bank that's been so foolish into this new bank, and we'll get things straightened out. Well, a day or so, I got a call from the president of the bank we fired. And he said, can't we do something about this? And do you really have to, do we have to terminate the contract? And I said, yes, Alaska can't take the hit because our reputation was on the line. So I said, yeah, you're fired. It is now a great big national bank, but I had the guts to fire him.
Well, finally, I want to ask you about another venture, and maybe that transition committee you referenced, but I want to ask about the capital move and the Frank Committee.
Oh, yeah.
How did the Frank Committee, A, get its name, and talk a little bit about the attempt to move the capital?
Well, I can't remember the exact year we did this, but you will recall that when we started getting oil revenue, it was pouring into the state coffers like a river. And everybody wanted to spend some of it. People in the Mat-Su Valley decided that they wanted to move the capital to Wasilla or whatever. And a lot of them had speculated that it would, now that the state had a lot of money, that it would be an easy thing to move the capital to Wasilla or Willow or whatever. And we could afford to do it. Well, it was not, the money wasn't that great, and to have invested enough money in a wilderness area to provide the facilities that were absolutely essential to the efficient operation of the government, it would have taken billions and billions and billions of dollars. Juneau already had the facilities, and if the capital were moved from Juneau, it would seriously deprive that community of an economic base and probably destroy it. And I did not believe that it was a good trade-off, that we should destroy one city to build a new city when we didn't need it. So I was talking, a friend in Juneau, Felix Toner, I don't know if any of you might have known Felix, called me and he said, we need to do something to save Juneau. I said, yeah, you do. He said, we need to form a committee to put out the word of what exactly would happen and if the capital were moved, and the fact that the money being spent to move the capital would not be available to spend on schools, universities, and if you look back, you will note that there was a tremendous amount of money being spent on schools and the university and hospitals and all kinds of things that had long been neglected. And he said, would you head it up? Head up this committee. And I said, sure. As if I knew what I was doing. And C.B. Bettisworth was, they approached C.B. and oh, Lord. I'm really having troubles here. Remembering who the third person was on the committee. Do you remember?
I think
Robert,
we have
do you have the
CB
name?
here. He can help you. CB Bettisworth is here, so.
Oh, CB, are you here?
I am, Mary.
Who was the third person? Good. If you can't remember?
It was Carolyn Bushy.
Oh, that's right. Yes, right. Great, thank you. So the three of us got together, or was it just you and me? It was just you and me.
Just you and I in the morning in your office.
Yeah. It was a Saturday morning. It was cold as could be in the office.
It was the Saturday after the night before.
Oh, that's right. Anyway, we've decided we fooled around with names and finally came up with, well, then it was it Frustrated Alaskans Needing Knowledge?
Correct.
Okay, so we came up with that. So, because it said Frank, you know, and we were going to be honest about things. But there was who was the Frank that took umbrage at it because we were using his name?
Well, the guy that sponsored the initiative, his first name was Frank, and I can't remember his last name. He owned a laundry in Anchorage.
Yeah, right, yeah. So anyway, we announced to the world we were the Frank Committee.
Well, it worked great because all we had to do was say, let's be Frank. But Mary really crafted that name. It was
Yeah.
wonderful.
And we had a wonderful time. We worked with great people. I was talking to Sue Bullock just the other day, and she's in great shape. And of course, Walt is gone, Walt DeVries. But they were professional campaign people. Sue was polar, and Walt.
I think the thing that's interesting about that team was that Walt DeVries had been chief of staff for Mitt Romney's dad, George Romney in Michigan.
Yeah.
So they were really knowledgeable about how to get things done, and were really the asset.
Right.
That things work.
Well, you know, Mary, right now we've kind of naturally segued into about this time in Tall Timbers, I opened it up for the audience to ask questions.
Let me say one thing before you do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'd like to go back to the time I was working for Bob in Washington, D.C. I had worked on a project before I went back to Washington to try to do something to improve housing for the Native people. The statistics on tuberculosis are just terrible, and the only way we could really fight was not just the drugs alone that they had discovered, but also decent housing, because the housing was a great incubator for TB. And one of the persons that we worked with was Bob Bennett, who was then the area director of the BIA. He was Rosebud Sioux, and the Sioux Reservation, or the Rosebud Reservation, is in one of the Dakotas. I can't remember which. And then I went on and did other things for a while, and then when I back in Washington, one of the problems that we had facing us was land claims and getting straightened out the land claims between the state and the Native communities. And discovered that Bob Bennett had been shifted, so he was then commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the top banana. And the phone rang and he said, we can't have reservations in Alaska. They won't work. I said, I know, nobody wants them. The natives don't want them, we don't want them. And he said, well, come up with something. I said, well, do you have any ideas? He said, no. You're the lawyer, you just, you come up with it. So I did. I worked hard thinking, trying to figure out what kind of model could we follow that would do what was needed to be done. And I finally arrived at the idea of a corporation. And I talked to Bob Bartlett and Mary Lee Council. I told them I wanted to push this. In the meantime, the delegation had received a communication from the Interior Department transmitting a proposed land claim settlement bill, which included the creation of reservations all over the state. And so we convened a staff meeting. I think it was, I don't know whether, well, it doesn't matter. At the meeting were Beezer, oh gosh, name escapes me, and Laura Olson for Greening's office, Don Greeley from Rivers's office, he was the representative, and Mary Lee and I from Bartlett's office. We were all jammed together. And I, in agreement, I said, look, we need to do corporation because nobody wants reservations and we have to have an entity. So I suggest that we go for reservations. We discussed it, spent about an hour and a half talking about it. And so then we all went back to our respective offices, sold our leaders on the concept, and it was Herb Beezer. Herb said that they would send a response to the Interior Department's proposal for reservations and their suggestion how to settle the land claims. And on Greening, because Greening was on the committee that had jurisdiction over the Department of the Interior, and asked the Interior Department to draft a bill that included the creation of corporations instead of reservations, and asked them to give us that service. So they did. It blew the Interior Department's mind because it did a couple of things. First of all, it vested control in the natives of what economic and other use is made of the land. And while they were the supposed owners of the land and reservations, they had no more authority to use it for economic development purposes than the Interior Department wanted them to. And it was vital in Alaska because if it had been left to reservations, we'd still be dealing with land claims. We'd still not have title to our lands, and the natives would not have title to their lands. And it meant that the Interior Department lost jurisdiction over any economic or other development of the natives' lands because they had jurisdiction over the assets owned by their clients, by the people for whom they were built to serve. Well, what the people owned were pieces of paper. They were the share certificates, not the land, because the corporations would own the land. Well, corporations won, and I ask you, if you look around the state, you will see that the native corporations have become economic engines in the areas in which they're located. It's the most remarkable thing. It never occurred to me when I was suggesting corporations that it could possibly blossom the way it has. But the development of those corporations by the people who own them is, I think, one of the great efforts that any people have ever accomplished. And it fulfills one of the things my mother used to say. You really have to hand it to a people who can go from Stone Age tools to airplane mechanics in one generation. talking about the intelligence of the native people of Alaska. And they took to, the modern day natives took to the corporate model, saw the benefits, and found out what it's like not to have the Interior Department, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and around their necks, stopping them from developing economically. It's just a thrill to me. And I never mentioned it because there were, there must be 30 or 40 people claiming that they originated the idea, and that's fine, I don't care. You know, what was accomplished was what I wanted accomplished, so it didn't bother me a bit. And I had long since left the arena, so I just think we should speak admiringly of our native people. And we are sitting on land that my grandfather insisted be selected for the University of Alaska. He was on the Board of Regents or whatever they were at the time. And he really fought for this hill.
Well, it's 8:20 now, and so let me open it up for a few questions or follow-ups from audience members. If you would identify who you are for Mary, because it would be helpful. So, does anyone have any questions?
Okay, I go to that. I do. Mary, you did not mention Jimmy, your brother, who ended up as mayor of Fairbanks.
Oh, that's true. And he was borough attorney too.
That's right.
And I think he ran for the legislature, but didn't get elected. But when we were all living in Juneau, I think he worked in the legislature. So he loved public service. And so he had a good time. So let's see, there were my grandfather, that was Anton, my uncle Arnold, my uncle Jalmer, and my brother Jim. 4.
Yeah, the apple didn't fall far from the tree.
Mary, Julie Scott, one time you and I were driving around and you stopped at an attorney's office and you picked up this sheaf of papers having to do with mining. And then I found out you're a member of the Miners Association. How did you get involved in that part of the industry?
So how did you get part of the Miners Association?
Oh, well, it's a very nice story. I was working for a law firm in Juneau after I left the commissioner's office. One of the partners in the firm was Fred Eastaugh. And I don't know whether any of you would have known him or not. He was a very prominent Republican, married to the daughter of a very prominent Republican, R.E. Robertson. And Fred took a liking to me, and we never had any political problems at all. If we talked politics, it was just talk. But he was very insistent. He said, well, you owe it. You're a part of the mining community. Your family's been mining, you know. So you've got to join the Miners Association. Well, I did. And so I went to the meetings in Juneau and had a good time. And then I moved to Fairbanks. And I can't remember, that was, I think I became president of the Miners Association before I moved to Fairbanks, but it doesn't really matter. I served as chairman of the branch in Juneau for a while, thanks to Fred. And then I moved to Fairbanks, and I was elected chairman of the branch here, and then I was also president of the organization. And it was all because of Fred and his insistence that I owed it to the world, I guess. But my Uncle Arnold was a mining engineer in Dawson. He was a mayor here in Fairbanks, but it was in the 30s that he moved his family to Dawson because the FE company owned a gold mine over there on the Klondike River and needed somebody to run it who understood about dredges. And Arnold was an expert, I guess, on dredges, according to Tom Bunsen. And so they went over there. And I don't know where that story was going. Doesn't matter.
We have another question.
Mary, this is Larry Zervitz.
Yeah.
I just wondered, what motivated you to go to law school?
Well, I think Robert mentioned I didn't like the low pay and the lack of challenge that was available for the most part. I had no special skills or education that would give me an opportunity to do something of a higher grade in government service. And what would I do in private service, in general public? So I decided that the only way for me to get anywhere in the world was to go to law school. And it was economics.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
CD?
She didn't really tell us where she went to college to start with.
Where did you go to college, undergraduate?
Gonzaga University in Spokane. I was glad to get out of there.
What university?
Gonzaga University?
Gonzaga, yeah.
The first, I shouldn't tell you this, but I will. The first day, freshmen, they had a freshman assembly and to welcome the newcomers. And we had one nice welcome, I'm glad you're here, that kind of thing. Then the dean of men got up and he said, well, we didn't want to have women, but we needed the money. And I said, fine, I will pay what I have to pay, but I have never sent them a cent. And if they ever ask me for some, I said, you go back and clean that old buddy's mouth. And of course, he's long since gone. But I thought that's my small gesture toward.
Well, Mary Nordale, thank you so much for spending an evening with us.
Oh, thank you.